First of all, thank you guys so much for having me out here. So, for my book report, I've decided to do Robert Caro's 5-volume series, The Years of Lyndon Johnson. Each volume in this series is about 1,000 pages, plus footnotes. Before I begin reporting on each of these books, at great length, Means of Ascent, Master of the Senate, Passage of Power, and the final volume, which has yet to be released, I would like to read to you my favorite chapter, entitled Master Strokes. I'm not actually going to do that. I've already done it to myself. But I am going to talk about Lyndon Johnson's crazily epic biography by Robert Caro. Why the hell am I reading these books? This is a fair question. So, about a year ago, my friend Eric and I got drunk one night, and I was complaining that there is nothing equivalent in American literature to Shakespeare's history plays. He was all like, "No way, dude, there totally is." And I was all like, "What?" Now my eyes are a bunch of question marks. And he recommended to me Forverdal's 7-volume series called The Narratives of Empire. Each of these books covers a different epoch in American history, starting with Aaron Burr and ending with the post-World War II White House. There's also one whole book about Woodrow Wilson and Hollywood, since Forverdal considers Hollywood a vital factor in American imperialism. Anyway, I tore through all these books viciously and with glee. Forverdal is fucking great. And then he died this year, and I was all like, wow, that dude was one mean and amazing American. He managed to make the most tired of history relevant for contemporary study, while simultaneously telling some great gossipy stories about all of our founding figures. For instance, he subtly suggests in his novel Lincoln that Abraham Lincoln was so intent on holding our warring country together because Lincoln was bisexual, and therefore also intent on holding these pieces of his own warring self together. That is Shakespearean. Did you know that Martin Van Buren, probably most of your favorites, president, probably the illegitimate son of Aaron Burr, and thusly Martin Van Buren's entire administration was revenge on Hamilton, Jefferson, and all the other early American aristocrats? Also, he was Dutch. He spoke with a Dutch accent. That's crazy to me. After I was done with all these books, and because it was an election year, I was hungry for even more crazy-ass books about politics. Something about Mitt Romney's face made me wonder, are all politicians evil Batman villains? I read about Robert Caro publishing his latest volume of the life of Lyndon Johnson, and I was all like, let's do this, Caro. Because I never have any money, I decided to download all of these books onto my phone. I stole all the movie files, and we were in business. I'm the guy who stole Robert Caro's 10,000-page life of Lyndon Johnson and is reading them on his phone. I'm from Texas, but I live in New York. Of course I'd be fascinated by Lyndon Johnson, but why does Caro give a shit? Caro is probably the greatest living biographer, researcher, and historian. He wins the Pulitzer Prize as easy as a pothead in study hall shooting you with a rubber band. So why did he choose to devote his life to writing about LBJ? One answer is that he hated him. And that The Years of Lyndon Johnson is a study in revenge, a life's work as vendetta. Another answer is that Johnson is the only iconic 60s liberal that no one shot to death. Though his life intersected all the fascinating martyrs of his day, was just as important. Another answer, a more troubling answer, is that everything we know about the 60s is absolutely wrong, and LBJ was the secret hero behind all the cool liberal shit that we ascribe to 60s radical progressives. According to television and movies, thanks to the Beatles, Sylvia Plath, and weed, a bunch of hippies, black people, immigrants, and women, who were all best friends, and made a difference in one crazy summer of sex and hairdos. The politicians of the day, the Kennedys notwithstanding, were just a bunch of bumbling squares with jowls and foreheads, who accidentally laughed against their will to this psychedelic ship of progress. After reading Caro, however, you realize that this isn't what happened at all. All those bullshit baby boomer movies we've been watching our entire lives are wrong. The radical era didn't just come from the people rising up with one to demand change. As usual, the people were mostly busy working themselves to death and being dumb. The radical era, in a large part, came from one terrible human being who was able to get a colossal amount of shit done before anybody noticed. And was too good at politics for anyone to stop him. He was a murderer, a sadist, and a ruthless political tactician, but he was on our side. I grew up in the shadow of LBJ, as anyone does who lives in Texas. There's even a giant animatronic bust of LBJ at his presidential library in Austin that tells stories. You can sit around and listen to Lyndon Johnson gab at you for hours. It wasn't until reading Caro that I saw him as anything but a hilarious caricature. Instead of getting into the history too much, because who cares really, I'm just going to lay down some fun facts about LBJ for you. Alright. So while he was a congressman, he managed through sheer force of will to convince the power companies that it would be profitable to bring electricity to the poorest parts of the country. Leading the fight for rural electrification, he bribed, cajoled, threatened, like-buttoned, finger-pointed, blackmailed, and seduced his way into getting electricity to the masses, easing the lives of probably millions. After that, he basically never had to do another thing as a congressional rep, and he could still get elected every year in his district, allowing him to focus on other things, like taking over the world. He was basically single-handedly responsible. Thank you, Caro. Single-handedly responsible. That's an LBJ move right there. Just banging it. He was basically single-handedly responsible for passing all civil rights legislation in the 20th century, even though he didn't even really believe in civil rights. In fact, he probably didn't believe in anything. Check this out as a list of accomplishments. The Clean Air Act of 1963, the Civil Rights Act of 1964, the Urban Mass Transportation Act of 1964, the Wilderness Act, the Food Stamp Act, motherfucker invented food stamps, the Economic Opportunity Act, the Housing Act of 1964, the Higher Education Act of 1965, the Older Americans Act, the Social Security Act, the Voting Rights Act, which repealed the poll tax, Immigration and Nationalization Services Act, the Freedom of Information Act, the Age Discrimination and Employment Act, the Public Broadcasting Act of 1967, the Architectural Barriers Act, the Bilingual Education Act, Civil Rights Act of 1968, and the Gun Control Act of 1968. How did he do this? LBJ smoked 3.5 packs of cigarettes a day. He's most famous for smoking 2 cigarettes at once, like a cartoon character. Everyone in his family was also named LBJ. True, Lady Bird Johnson, who he married the day that on their first date, he proposed marriage to her. He was like, hey, let's get married. She was like, oh, I don't know, maybe not. And he was like, no, come on, it'll be great. And they got married, mainly just because of her name, LBJ. Literally, it's like the signs pointing to it. He named his daughters Linda Bird Johnson and Lucy Baines Johnson. And even his goddamn dog was named Little Beagle Johnson. So the reason he did this, he said to everybody as a joke, is because we can all share the same luggage, you know? So when LBJ quit smoking after his first heart attack, he did it by leaving packs of his favorite cigarettes around with one peeking out almost everywhere he went. He surrounded himself in a cocoon of total temptation so that every day not smoking would get slightly easier after being as hard as humanly possible. This is how he did everything. After his presidency, he retired to his ranch, started smoking and drinking again as much as he wanted, and died within the decade alone of a heart attack while reaching for the telephone. He invented the idea of sending money to the National Convention, which would then dole out this money politically in a communist fashion, taking from the rich districts where congressional seats were guaranteed and giving it to the poor ones to get people elected on a national scale. He conducted much of his business in the bathroom. He had chronic kidney stones, and he was also just an asshole, so he would make his underlings and even his peers follow him to the John in order to talk to them whenever possible. It was a power thing. One of his favorite things to do was literally wave his dick around at smart people from good colleges. Literally. According to him, this was the only way he had effectively found to get them to stop talking. He called his beloved penis Jumbo. This is facts. He famously raised the minimum wage by 30% in 2 hours by telling the Democrats that if they didn't vote for this bill immediately, then they'd never be able to pass any legislation, and simultaneously telling the Republicans that if they didn't pass this tiny increase, the Democrats would raise it by 50%. There was a huge panic on the floor of the Senate, and the bill was passed without debate. Both sides thought they'd won. Both sides considered him their champion. Until the bill passed, nobody had raised the minimum wage for 10 years, despite bills being introduced in every session. Wall Senate Majority Leader used to stash people away in hidden rooms and alcoves in the Senate in order to bring them down for votes at key moments in order to demoralize the Republicans. He would be all like, well, I guess we don't have the votes, and I guess nobody will get any food stamps or public housing this year. But wait, who is behind that tapestry? He won his first Senate campaign made by borrowing one of the first helicopters from the Air Force and using it to tour around Texas instead of driving. Nobody in America had ever seen a helicopter before. The newspapers called it the Johnson City Windmill. He is responsible for perhaps the most famous campaign ad in history. It's the one where the little girl is in the field and the nuclear bomb goes off, freeze-framing her forever. Everybody told him that the ad was too exploitative, too awful. But he was all like, no, to the contrary, it is perfect. He cheated in every single election he was ever a part of. He even cheated in school elections when he was a kid. He divided his college up into arbitrary political parties and threatened newspaper reporters, thereby threatening to expose them as secret fans of other football teams. He managed to put Texans in every single lever of power during the 1950s. Sam Rayburn was the leader of the House of Representatives, basically a communist, and he controlled that. Johnson controlled the Senate, and Eisenhower was president for 2 gloriously evil terms. All the same men were from the same county in Texas. Sam Rayburn used to tell everyone what a beautiful baby Eisenhower had been. After the assassination, LBJ thought he was next. He spent all his time up in the air. He'd always been a huge proponent of gun control, and he almost managed to railroad a huge, comprehensive gun control package through Congress during the 14 days after the Kennedy assassination. Even still, he managed to pass the largest comprehensive gun control legislation in American history. His favorite foods were canned green peas and tapioca. He was famous for eating double meals. He couldn't just eat one meal. He was the first and only president so far to take the oath of office from a woman. He loved Fresca so much that he had a special fountain installed in the White House. Not only did he cheat on his wife, he cheated on her with his help, serially and in tandem. They would go out cheating together. No one knew what to do about this. No one knew what to say. It broke people's minds. When asked why she let him do this, he was like, Lady Bird said, Lyndon Johnson loves people. He appointed Thurgood Marshall, the first African-American Supreme Court Justice, and Abe Fortas, trying to get him raised to the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court, which would have made him the first Jewish Supreme Court Justice. It didn't work, but he tried like hell. And after a massive heart attack at the age of 46, he went into a deep depression. His brother planted an article in the newspaper saying, it's okay for people with heart attacks to win presidential elections. So he saw it and was like back on his feet. He went to Hawaii and shook the hands of lepers even after advisors told him the disease was communicable. He had an assembly line handshaking style where he'd shake somebody's hand with one hand and then throw him over his shoulder with the other so that he could get to the next person faster. He once urinated on a Secret Serviceman who was shielding him from public view just because he was the president, just because he could. He started the war on poverty. The Kennedys were afraid of him, so they wanted to find something for him to do while he was vice president. So what they said was, hey, Lyndon Johnson, why don't you try to get us to the moon? And he fucking did! Anyway, the entire thesis of Robert Caro's gargantuan biography is that power doesn't always corrupt, but power always reveals. He chose LBJ as a subject because Lyndon Johnson was never anything but corrupt. He was such an amazing and effective liberal president because he was totally grounded and centered and comfortable with his corruptness. Contemplating LBJ, you get the sense that the United States didn't just become a liberal country because it was ready to do so. No, it was forced to become liberal by this crazy giant from Johnson City, Texas, who rode around in a helicopter, was as mad and delightful as Peter the Great, and also as dangerous and unhinged. So why did this immoral sociopath do all this nice shit for America? There's only one answer: spite. He was perhaps history's most evil dude, but he did good things for the country despite terrible people, and he did terrible things personally despite the good people who believed in him. For me, the takeaway message of the years of Lyndon Johnson is perhaps the opposite of what Caro intended. After reading this book, there's 4 books that are out, I feel that one of the key problems that we face as a country is that we hold our elected leaders to personal and ethical standards that are far too high for anyone interesting to maintain. Everybody knew that Lyndon Johnson was a criminal in the 60s. Everyone loved him. The trick was making sure that the only way that this awesome criminal could get the love, respect, and power that he craved so desperately was by passing legislation that gave the biggest finger to the elites, to the rich, to the uptrodden, to the hyper-privileged. When you find yourself on trial defending your life against a false accusation, you don't want the most moral lawyer. You want the lawyer who's going to do whatever it takes to get you off, and who doesn't really care if you're innocent or guilty. The same thing is true about the elected officials we send to Washington to represent us. It is a paradox. The conservatives who are actually the most effective are the ones who are the most idealistic and pure, even as they seek to scrub the weird and the marginal from the face of the earth. But the progressives who are the most effective are the criminal strategists, the Aaron Burrs, the Nancy Pelosi's, the Littlefingers, the Mayor Carcettis. If we want change, we have to accept that it won't be pretty. We will have to pay for it. Caro makes the case that Vietnam was the price for civil rights, since they both came from the machinations of one awful human being. I learned from these books that if we want good things to happen, either we must change our system so that it can't be manipulated by the most evil of us for the most petty of reasons, which might be impossible given the raw energy of evil people, or we must change our expectations and hope that there's at bottom a law of conservation of good and evil, and that the best among us are not out there scrabbling for power to checkmate the dangerous ones, but are instead finding new ways to tie our goals and dreams to these inexhaustible demons that can always be found wherever there is money, whiskey, fire, and violence. Like Lyndon Johnson, we must get, if we want to steer people like Lyndon Johnson, we must get to know them and learn to love them.